The war had been over for 6 hours, and the ground was still too hot to walk on without armored boots. Ruga moved through the wreckage slowly, his heavy claws pressing into volcanic ash that had once been a forest of iron trees. The sky above Drakvale was the color of old blood, thick with smoke and the chemical trails of ships that would never fly again. Somewhere behind him, the Ironwing Legion was pulling together its dead and counting its wounded. Somewhere ahead, the Sarati Collective's broken fleet was limping away under ceasefire terms that nobody fully believed in. 6 years of war, billions dead, and now silence. Ruga did not like silence. It always meant something was wrong. He had been assigned sweep duty, check the outer blast zones for salvageable equipment, weapons, power cells, anything the Legion could use. It was not a glorious task. It was the kind of work given to soldiers who were still breathing when others were not. He walked in long, measured steps, his sensor unit scanning left and right, reading heat signatures and material compositions in quiet beeps. He almost stepped over the pod. It was half buried under a collapsed support strut and a meter of ash. Small, smooth, completely wrong for the surrounding wreckage. The Sarati built nothing that curved like that. Ruga stopped. He crouched down, which took some effort given that he was nearly 3 meters tall and built like a cliff face, and brushed the ash away with one careful hand. The pod was human-made. He knew the design. Terran emergency survival units, single occupant, rated for atmospheric re-entry and low-level radiation. The Terran Confederacy had no formal presence in this war. They were a minor species, quiet and largely ignored by both sides. Finding their equipment here made no sense. He pried the pod open. Inside, packed into a thermal cushion with an oxygen recycler humming on its last reserves, was a human infant. Alive. Ruga stared at it for a long time. The infant stared back at him. It did not scream. It did not cry. Its eyes, small, dark, impossibly soft for a creature that had apparently survived a battlefield, tracked Ruga's face with quiet, puzzled attention. It was dehydrated. Its lips were cracked. It smelled of recycled air and something faintly organic that Ruga could not name. It was, by any measurement he had been trained to use, in very bad shape. It was also, very clearly, not dead. He called it in. Warlord Sova arrived with 4 soldiers and an expression that suggested she had not slept in 2 days and had no patience for surprises. She was old by Vrail standards. Her scales had faded from deep bronze to the pale gray of old ash, and one of her wings had been clipped in the 3rd year of the war and never fully healed. She walked with a slight lean that her soldiers knew better than to mention. She looked into the pod, looked at the infant, and said nothing for a full minute. "Human," she said finally. "Yes, Warlord. We are on a Vrail world, in a war fought between Vrail and Sarati. There are no human forces within 4 star systems of this location." "Yes, Warlord." "And yet." "Yes, Warlord." Sova studied the infant with the same expression she used when reading battle reports she did not fully believe. The infant, for its part, had shifted its attention to her and was now watching her with the same unblinking focus it had given Ruga. Sova reached one scarred finger toward it slowly. The infant grabbed the tip of that finger with both tiny hands. Sova did not move. She looked at the grip. She looked at the infant's face. Lorne, standing 2 paces behind her, spoke up. Lorne was a veteran of 4 campaigns and had the temperament of a rock in a rainstorm. Nothing moved him and nothing surprised him, but everything annoyed him. "Leave it," he said. "We have no resources for a human infant. We have barely enough for our own wounded. It is not our problem." Sova did not look at him. "If we leave it, and any Sarati scout vessel passes through this zone in the next cycle, they find a human child that a Vrail sweep team walked past. That tells the Sarati we are either weak enough to ignore problems or soft enough to be moved by them." She finally looked up. "Neither is acceptable." Lorne made a sound that was not quite a growl. "So we keep it. A human child? In the Legion?" "I did not ask for your comfort, Lorne. I stated Legion policy." She pulled her finger free from the infant's grip. With some effort, Ruga noticed, and straightened up. "It travels with the unit. Find it water. Find it food. Find it warmth. Ruga, it is your responsibility until further notice." Ruga looked at the infant. The infant looked at Ruga. "Yes, Warlord." The march back to Fortress Kale took 14 hours over terrain that was difficult even for armored Vrel soldiers. The infant rode in Ruga's supply pack, wrapped in a thermal sheet, cushioned on his spare kit. Ruga expected it to cry. All the records he had ever read about human infants described near-constant noise, distress signals, comfort demands, biological announcements of every minor discomfort. This infant made almost no sound at all. It slept for the first 4 hours. When it woke, it did not cry. It looked around at the black landscape and the towering soldiers surrounding it. It looked at the sky. It looked at Ruga's face when Ruga checked on it. It grabbed his claw again and held it. Ruga let it. Lorne walked behind them the whole march and said nothing, which was, for Lorne, a significant statement. At the fortress, the Legion medic, a sharp, no-nonsense dragon named Bress, gave the infant a full scan, found it dehydrated and slightly malnourished, but otherwise undamaged, and announced with clear personal offense that she was not trained for human biology, but would manage. She sourced appropriate nutrition formulas from the Legion's small diplomatic supply cache. She temperature-regulated a cargo storage crate with an extra heat coil and told Ruga it was now his bunk for the infant. Ruga accepted this without argument. Sova issued the order that same evening. Full Legion broadcast, every rank and post. The child was under Ironwing protection. It was not a mercy gesture. It was not sentiment. It was a statement of Legion will. Any soldier who questioned the child's presence could take that question directly to her. Nobody took the question to her. Ruga gave the child a name that night. He sat beside the modified cargo crate, listening to the infant breathe in the low heat of the supply room, and thought about what it was. Not what it had been, a lost thing in a dead war zone, but what it was right now. Breathing when it should not be. Quiet when everything around it should have driven it to panic. In Vrel, there was a word for a fire that would not go out no matter how small it burned. A fire that stayed alive in impossible conditions, patient and persistent, waiting for fuel. Drav. He wrote it in his log that night, below a record of the day's sweep and the infant's health status. I have named the child Drav. It does not cry much. For something so fragile, it is very quiet. It watches everything. He closed the log. In the crate, the infant breathed slowly and steadily, small chest rising and falling in the dark. Outside, the burnt world of Drakvale settled into its first quiet night after 6 years of war. Inside, a small ember refused to go out. He built his first chair when he was 4 years old. Nobody told him to do it. Nobody offered to help. He simply looked at the Vrel furniture in the common room, all of it scaled for creatures 3 times his height, with seats that put his feet nowhere near the floor, and decided the situation was unacceptable. He dragged a crate from the storage hall, found a flat piece of hull plating in the scrap yard behind the forge, and constructed something that was technically a chair. It leaned slightly to the left. The surface was cold in winter. He used it every day for 2 years, until he built a better one. That was Drav, 9 years old, the only human inside Fortress Kaldras, and the most stubborn creature within 100 kilometers in any direction. He was small even for his age, compact and wiry where Vrel children his equivalent age were already the size of large horses and still growing. He had dark hair he kept cut short because long hair collected forge soot. His hands were always slightly grimy. He wore Legion-issue utility gear cut down and re-stitched to fit him, which he had learned to do himself because the Legion tailor had refused to handle the job more than once. He spoke Vrel before he spoke Standard, fluent, accent-perfect Vrel, because it was all he had heard for the first years of his life, and when he did speak Standard, it came out with a flat, precise quality that sounded like nobody from Earth. The soldiers of the Ironwing Legion did not quite know what to do with him, so most of them had settled on leaving him alone. Ruga checked on him every morning and every evening. Lorne avoided him with the focused dedication of a soldier completing a difficult assignment. Sova watched him from across rooms and said nothing. Drav noticed all of it. He noticed everything. He had taken to watching the Legion's training drills from the upper observation rail that ran around the main yard. He could not participate. The drills were built for Vrel bodies, for strength and speed that a human child could not approach. But he watched. He watched every morning when the early squads ran formation exercises, tracing their movement patterns in a small notebook with a stylus he had taken from the administrative office and never returned. He watched the afternoon combat drills and noted which soldiers telegraphed their strikes and which did not. He watched the senior officers conduct sand table exercises and memorized every formation they used. Ruga found him there one morning, notebook half filled, watching 3 squads run a flanking drill in the yard below. "You should be in language study," Ruga said. "I finished the language modules," Drav said, not looking up. "The full sequence. The administrative terminal let me complete them all." "Ruga, that squad on the left is 3 steps behind the timing count. They're going to collapse the angle if nobody corrects it." Ruga looked at the drill. The squad on the left collapsed the angle 30 seconds later. The drill master shouted the correction Drav had already named. Ruga looked at the boy for a moment. Then he sat down on the rail beside him and said nothing. It was Elder Vora who became the real problem. Vora was the Legion's battle historian and lore-keeper, ancient even by Vrel standards, with scales so dark they had gone almost black with age, and eyes that had watched 4 centuries of war. He maintained the Legion's historical archives and conducted formal instruction sessions for officer candidates twice each week. He was also, in Drav's assessment, the most knowledgeable creature inside the fortress and therefore the one Drav most needed to talk to. Vora refused to see him 3 times before Drav stopped requesting appointments and simply stood outside the archive room until the Elder came out. Vora looked down at the small human boy standing in the corridor. Drav looked up at the ancient dragon. "I want to study Vrel military history," Drav said. "You are not a soldier," Vora said. "Not yet. You are human." Also true. Military history is for those who will make military decisions. You will make no military decisions. You are a child of a species that had no involvement in any war this Legion has fought. What possible use could you have for this knowledge? Drav had thought about this specific argument for 2 weeks, which was how long he had been standing outside archive rooms and being turned away. He said, "I'll make you a bet. Teach me about the Battle of Sorin, 1 session, 1 hour. I'll listen, I won't interrupt. Afterward, give me 1 week. If I can find a flaw in the Vrel command decisions during that battle using only what you teach me today, you give me a proper course of study. If I can't, I go away and never bother you again." Vora stared at him. "You think you can find a flaw in the Battle of Sorin, the victory that ended the Second Expansion War?" "I think there might be one," Drav said. "I'd rather find out from someone who knows the real history than from the official records, which I've already read and which are clearly edited." There was a long silence. Vora stepped aside and opened the archive room door. He found the flaw in 4 days. It was in the Eastern Logistics Corridor, a supply line that had been left with minimal defense during the final push, on the assumption that the enemy's eastern forces were too depleted to exploit it. The assumption had been correct, barely, by a margin of 6 hours. If the Sarati commander had redirected 2 battalions from the southern theater 6 hours earlier, the Vrel flanks would have broken. The battle would have been lost. Drav drew it out on a map and slid it across Vora's desk. Vora looked at the map for a very long time. Then, without a word, he pulled a chair to the opposite side of the desk and sat down and began talking. He talked for 3 hours, unprompted, covering the full political context of the war, the command decisions that had been edited from official records, and 3 other battles that shared similar structural weaknesses. He talked the way someone talks when they have held information for too long and finally found a listener worth the effort. Drav wrote everything down. Among the young soldier recruits, there was a dragon named Sarah. She was a few years older than Drav in equivalent terms, already beginning combat training, already showing the kind of controlled aggression that marked good Vrel soldiers. She was fast, disciplined, and had a very low tolerance for things she considered beneath her attention. She had decided, after watching Drav for about a month, that he was beneath her attention. Drav had decided, after watching Sarah for about a month, that she was the best fighter in the recruit cohort and the most interesting mind he had encountered so far, and that her ignoring him was therefore a waste of both their time. He started asking her questions during the meal periods, small tactical questions, framed as though he was uncertain and needed guidance. He was not uncertain, but Sarah would answer, and then correct herself when the answer felt incomplete, and then argue with her own correction. And by the end of the meal they were deep in a discussion about formation theory that neither of them had planned. She always walked away looking slightly annoyed, as though something had happened that she hadn't agreed to. This continued for most of that year. The raid came in the last month of the cold season. A Sarati scouting party, violating ceasefire terms that everyone knew were fragile, hit the fortress eastern perimeter in the early pre-dawn hours. It was not a major attack. It was the kind of probing strike meant to test response times and identify weaknesses. 3 Sarati strike units came in low from the eastern ridge, while the fortress sensors were focused on an energy reading that had been placed deliberately to draw attention west. The sentinels on the eastern wall saw the first unit. They did not see the flanking movement. A second unit coming up the ridge blind spot, angled to hit the recruit barracks. Drav saw it. He had been awake in the upper observation rail, which he used at odd hours because nobody else ever went there, reading Vora's notes on Third-era defensive formations. He saw the heat signatures on the ridge. He saw the angle. He did the math in 3 seconds and ran. He could not fight them. He was 9 years old and had no weapon and no armor. What he had was a working knowledge of the fortress communication system. He had spent 2 months learning it because knowing how a place worked was, in his view, simply basic sense. He hit the eastern perimeter alarm, the barracks evacuation signal, and the general defense alert in sequence in under 20 seconds. The sentinels scrambled. The flanking unit walked into a fully armed and positioned defense response instead of sleeping recruits. The raid was repelled in minutes. The cost was low. The recruit barracks, where Sarah and a full cohort of young soldiers had been sleeping, were completely unharmed. Sova found out within the hour what had happened and who had triggered the alarm. She came to the observation rail and found Drav still there, sitting on the floor, watching the cleanup operation below. She looked at him. He looked at her. She said, "Good eyes." She left. Drav sat in the dark for a long time after that, those 2 words sitting in his chest like something warm that had no name yet. He did not know, then, that he would carry them for the rest of his life. He just knew that they were the best thing anyone had ever said to him, and that he intended to be worth them. Below, the fortress went back to quiet. The cold season wind moved over the volcanic stone. The small ember kept burning. The reports started coming in from the outer rim 18 months before anyone in the Legion took them seriously. A mining station in the Veth corridor, silent mid-transmission. A Vrail cargo vessel found drifting, all systems intact, crew absent. Not dead, not escaped, simply gone, as though something had removed them with the care of someone clearing pieces off a board. A border patrol that reported a formation of ships unlike any known design and then stopped reporting. The machines did not announce themselves. They did not send demands. They simply moved through space, taking what they found, and moved on. The Vrail War Council named them the Vel Convergence and issued a monitoring order, which was the kind of response given to problems that a council did not yet want to admit were real. Drav had read every report by the time he was 22. By 23, he had mapped the expansion pattern on a personal terminal, projected the next 12 months of movement, and written a formal analysis requesting escalated military response. He submitted it through the proper Legion channels. It was acknowledged, filed, and not acted upon. He was 24 when he submitted his formal request to attempt the Rite of Iron. The rite was the gateway to full warrior status in the Ironwing Legion. Every soldier who wore the Legion's insignia had completed it. It was a 3-stage trial: endurance, combat, navigation, designed over centuries specifically for Vrail physiology. It was designed for creatures that could withstand volcanic heat without armor, trade blows with enough force to crack stone, and carry their own weight over brutal terrain for days without stopping. It had never been attempted by a human. The request had also never been made before, which meant there was no rule against it, which was the precise detail Drath had checked 3 times before submitting. High Commander Drath summoned him. Drath led the entire Vrail military hierarchy from the council chambers in the deep fortress. He was not old in the way Sova had been old, worn and tired and honest about it. Drath was the kind of old that had calcified into certainty. He had spent 50 years building the Vrail military into what it was, and what it was, in his view, worked. He looked at Drav the way someone looks at a calculation that keeps returning the wrong answer. "You have completed every academic program this Legion offers," Drath said. It was not a compliment. "You have studied under Elder Vora for 15 years. You speak Vrail better than some of my senior officers. You are personally protected by Warlord Sova's original standing order. None of that makes you a Vrail warrior. No, Drav agreed. The right does. Which is why I'm requesting to attempt it. The right will kill you. Possibly. That's the risk I'm choosing to take. Drav looked at him steadily. And if you die in the trial, this legion bears the weight of a human child it raised dying in a military test it was never designed for. You would make the Ironwing Legion look irresponsible, sentimental, careless. Drav said, then I won't die. The silence that followed was the kind that filled a room completely. Drav did not approve the request. What he did was decline to formally deny it, which under Legion protocol was functionally the same as approval. He was not going to set a precedent of blocking a request that had never been made before. He would, however, be watching. Ruga and Sarah were there when Drav walked out of Drav's office. Ruga asked what happened. Drav said the request was approved. Sarah looked at him for a long moment. She said, "Don't do anything stupid." He said he would try. She said that was not reassuring. Lorne heard about it that evening and immediately went to find Ruga to express his objection in full detail. Ruga let him. When Lorne was done, Ruga said, "He has already made the decision." Lorne said, "I know that. I just wanted someone to hear the objection." Ruga said he heard it. Lorne went away. He spent the next 3 weeks quietly making sure the equipment Drav would use was in peak condition, which was not something Lorne ever mentioned and which Drav noticed immediately. The rite began on a cold morning, witnessed by the Legion's senior officers and a number of soldiers who made no effort to hide that they had come to watch. Most of them expected the first stage to end things. The first stage was an endurance march through the thermal flats north of the fortress, 6 kilometers of volcanic ground where the surface temperature ran hot enough to soften standard boot soles. Vrail soldiers made the crossing in their natural heat resistance. Drav had spent 3 weeks building a cooling solution from Legion scrap parts, a circulatory gel layer inside modified boot liners, connected to a small pump unit at his belt, cycling temperature-regulated fluid through contact points at his feet and lower legs. It added weight. It made the crossing slower than any Vrail attempt on record. He did not stop. He reached the endpoint 90 minutes after the last Vrail comparison time. He was soaked through with sweat and his legs ached from the modified boots, and he crouched at the endpoint with his hands on his knees for about 30 seconds. Then he straightened up, checked the cooling unit, and indicated readiness for Stage 2. Stage 2 was combat. Specifically, combat against a designated opponent for a minimum of 10 minutes. Survival and the landing of 3 valid strikes constituted a pass. Drav's opponent was Oren, Lorne's nephew, a solid and straightforward soldier about Drav's age in equivalent terms, strong and fast, and completely confused about why he had been assigned this particular duty. "I don't want to hurt you," Oren said, before the timer started. "Try to land something clean," Drav said. "I need to know where your arm goes after the first strike." That's not reassuring either. The timer started. What followed was not a fight in the traditional sense. Drav could not match Oren physically, and he did not try. He moved around the space constantly, never in a straight line, making Oren commit to angles that didn't pay off, absorbing 2 solid hits that he was simply not fast enough to fully avoid and staying upright through them, because he had been conditioning himself specifically for taking Vrail force impacts at reduced levels. He found the pattern in Oren's footwork around the 4-minute mark. He waited. At 11 minutes, he put 3 precise, controlled strikes into the nerve cluster at the base of Oren's neck, the joint inside his right elbow, and the pressure point behind his left knee. None of them would have done serious damage. All of them, in real combat, would have created the opening for a finishing blow. Oren stepped back. He looked at Drav. He said, "Did you study my training history before this?" 6 months of observation notes, Drav said. He was breathing hard. "You always shift right before you extend. It's not a problem against Vrail opponents because they adjust faster than I can anyway. Against me, it was the opening." Oren considered this. Then he said, "I'm going to have to fix that." "I'd appreciate it," Drav said, "if you did it after the 3rd stage." The navigation maze was a sealed structure beneath the fortress, a 3-dimensional course of corridors, false paths, and environmental hazards, designed to test spatial awareness and decision-making under pressure. Vrail soldiers used visual acuity and directional memory. Drav used sound. He had spent 2 weeks mapping the acoustic properties of the maze's entrance chamber. Stone of that composition, at those dimensions, produced echoes with predictable patterns. He moved through the maze slowly, clicking his tongue at intervals, a sound he produced deliberately and quietly, and listening to the return. When the echo shortened, a wall was ahead. When it shifted pitch, the corridor curved. When it doubled, there was a junction. He completed the maze with no wrong turns. The first in Legion history to do so. The senior officers watching did not cheer. Vril did not cheer in that way. What happened was quieter and, Drav had learned, more meaningful. They stayed. After the trial ended, they stayed where they were and watched him, and nobody left the room until Drath himself had seen the result confirmed. Drath said nothing publicly. Sova was there. She had been brought out from the infirmary wing, where she spent more time than she used to, in a low mobility frame that helped carry her weight. She had not been informed the trial was today. Someone had told her anyway, and she had come, and she stood at the back of the gathered officers with her arms folded and watched every stage from beginning to end. When it was over, and Drav had been formally inducted, and the Legion's induction officer had spoken the traditional words, Drav looked for Sova across the room. She met his eyes. She nodded once. He had spent 24 years in a fortress full of dragons who measured worth in strength and endurance and will. He had been too small, too soft, too slow, too human, too everything that was not Vril. He had built furniture from scrap. He had stood in corridors until ancient dragons relented. He had walked across volcanic ground in cobbled-together boots and taken hits that left bruises for a week and navigated in the dark by the sound of his own voice. One nod from one old dragon, and all of it settled into something he could carry. That evening, Drav sat in the archive room with Elder Vora, who had not attended the trial and made no comment about it. They went through the latest Vel convergence movement reports together. Drav had updated his expansion map. The machines were now 3 systems closer than his last projection had estimated. Vora studied the map for a long time. Then he said, "Your analysis submitted 18 months ago. The council filed it." "Yes," Drav said. "It was correct." "Yes." "They will not remain comfortable filing things much longer," Vora said, with the careful neutrality of someone who had watched 4 centuries of councils avoid problems until the problems arrived anyway. 3 months later, the Vel convergence destroyed a Vril colony world. 300,000 dragons, dead in 6 hours. The Legion mobilized the next morning. Drav was assigned at the lowest available rank, as protocol required for a newly inducted soldier regardless of any other consideration. He accepted this without argument. He was already thinking 3 battles ahead. 7 years into the war, the Vel convergence killed its first Vril fleet commander, then its second, then its third. The machines did not do this by being stronger than the Vril, though they often were. They did it by being faster to learn. Every tactic the Vril used worked once, sometimes twice, and then the Vel had processed it and built a counter, and the tactic became a liability. Vril commanders were trained to overwhelm through force, to build momentum and strike hard, and press the advantage until the enemy broke. The Vel did not break. They adapted. The harder the Vril pushed, the faster the Vel learned the push. 7 years in, the Vril were not losing badly. They were losing slowly, which was in some ways worse. Drav had risen through 3 field promotions, each one following a crisis that had killed or incapacitated the officer above him. He was not climbing through ambition. He was climbing because the war kept creating vacancies, and he kept being the person who handled the situation after the vacancy appeared. He now commanded a battalion, 300 soldiers, 24 vehicles, and a sensor array that he had personally reconfigured twice because the factory settings left blind spots he found unacceptable. The battle at Draw Station happened in the 43rd month of the war. A Vel ambush, a real one, well planned, executed with machine precision, hit the Vril 3rd and 7th Legions simultaneously as they moved through the Dross orbital corridor. Both Legion commanders were gone in the first minutes. The battle fragmented into individual units trying to survive independently, which was exactly what the Vel formation was designed to encourage. Isolated units died faster than coordinated ones. The Vel had learned this about Vril fighting style in Year 2. Drav's battalion was on the outer edge of the engagement. His orders, from a commander who was now dead, had been to hold the station's docking ring. The docking ring was no longer strategically relevant. The relevant thing, looking at the engagement from the outer edge, was the shape of the Vel attack. They were pushing hard from the north corridor. It was the obvious push, the loud one, the one every surviving Vrail unit was reacting to. The push from the south was quieter and slower. Drav watched it on his sensor display for about 90 seconds and understood what it was. The Vel's flanking momentum, designed to swing around and close the pocket once the Vrail forces were fully committed north. He pulled his battalion back from the docking ring. He moved them into the industrial maintenance corridor that ran along the station's inner spine. Unpowered, unmonitored, not represented on the standard tactical grid because it was a maintenance route and not a military one. He had found it in the station's engineering schematics 3 days earlier because he always read the engineering schematics of any location he was assigned to. He positioned his battalion at the maintenance corridor's southern exit. He waited. The Vel flanking force came through the outer corridor right on schedule, moving fast, confident in the quiet. They hit Drav's battalion from exactly the angle he had prepared for. It was not a perfect engagement. His soldiers took losses, real ones, and he felt each one as a weight added to something he carried in his chest. But the Vel flanking unit was destroyed, its momentum converted entirely against itself, and the pocket it had been closing never closed. The surviving Vrail units rallied. Draw station held. Drav received a formal reprimand for abandoning his assigned position without authorization. He accepted it without argument, which confused the officer who delivered it, who had clearly expected pushback. There was no point in argument. The reprimand was technically correct. He had abandoned his position. The fact that the position was irrelevant and his decision had changed the outcome of the battle was a separate matter, and he knew from studying 7 years of Legion bureaucracy that mixing those two matters in a formal response never helped. General Tova reviewed the full battle logs 4 days later. Tova was not like Drath. Where Drath had built a career on certainty, Tova had built hers on accuracy, on seeing what was actually happening rather than what she expected to be happening. She had commanded the Vrail's second front for 3 years, held it at significant personal cost, and had no patience for the kind of pride that got soldiers killed. She was also one of the few senior officers who had read Drav's original Vel expansion analysis from 18 months before the colony world fell. She overrode the reprimand. She promoted Drav to Legion Commander, the highest field rank below the War Council. Drath's objection was formal, immediate, and detailed. He cited precedent, tradition, and the fact that no human had ever held Legion command in the history of the Vrail military. Tova cited the battle logs. Specifically, she cited the engagement timeline that showed Drav's decision point, the movement data from his battalion, and the moment the Vel flanking unit was destroyed. Then she said, "Give me a Vrail officer who can read that situation and execute that response in under 2 minutes, and I will give the post to them." Nobody offered a candidate. Drav took command of the Ironwing Legion on a gray morning with the fortress running on reduced power to conserve fuel. He did not give a speech. He walked into the main briefing room, waited for the senior staff to settle, and put his full tactical assessment of the current war situation on the display behind him. The briefing ran for 2 hours. It covered the Vel's known adaptation patterns, the 6 command decisions over the past year that he assessed as avoidable mistakes, the 3 geographic positions he intended to contest in the next month, and the changes he was making to the Legion's sensor configuration that afternoon. When it was done, the room was very quiet. Not uncertain quiet. Not hostile quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when people are already thinking about what they just heard. Lorne, sitting at the back of the room, caught Drav's eye as the officers filed out. He said nothing. He gave a very small nod that would have been invisible to anyone not specifically watching for it. The Vel Convergence noticed the change. Specifically, the Vel Prime Nexus, the central machine intelligence that directed the Convergence's military actions, noticed an anomaly in its behavioral models. The Vrail tactical pattern in the draw station engagement did not match any prior Vrail commander profile. It did not match any Vrail profile at all. The Nexus was built on the premise that all organic species followed predictable behavioral frameworks derived from their biology, culture, and historical combat doctrine. The draw station response followed none of those frameworks for the Vrail. It began targeting human infrastructure. This was not random. Human settlements in the Outer Rim, small, quiet, largely ignored by both sides of the war, began experiencing Vel incursions. Stations were disabled. Settlements were evacuated by machine force, not destroyed. The message was clear to anyone who knew how to read it. The Nexus had identified the anomaly's origin point. Drav read the message. He did not send a response. He moved 3 battalions into positions that looked like defensive reaction to the human infrastructure attacks, and were in fact staging areas for a strike. He was planning on the Vel's regional command node in Sector 9. The trap the Vel set for the Ironwing Legion in the following month was well constructed. Drav identified it 8 days before it was scheduled to spring. He spent those 8 days preparing a counter not to the trap, but to the expectation behind the trap, what the Vel assumed the Vrail would do when they hit it. He let the Legion walk into the ambush with full knowledge of the ambush, in a formation that looked like a standard Vrail advance, and was actually a delivery mechanism for a deep strike unit he had pre-positioned in the silence 3 weeks earlier. The Vel command node in Sector 9 burned. The War Council, which had been managing Tova's promotion of Drav with the careful attention of people watching something they were not sure was a mistake, began requesting his assessments directly. Drav said nothing. Then Sova died. She went in the infirmary wing on a quiet night, without drama, without pain, in her sleep. The medical report said her system had simply run out of the time that even Vrail biology had to give. She was old. She had been at war for most of her life. She had spent her last years watching a legion she built do things she had not imagined it could do, which was its own kind of completion. Ruga came to tell Drav in person. He stood in the doorway of the command room and said it plainly, the way Vrail said hard things, without softening it. Drav set down what he was working on. He looked at the wall for a moment. He said, "Thank you for telling me yourself." Ruga said there was no one else who should have told him. They did not say anything more than that. Drav took 1 hour. He went to the observation rail where he had spent half his childhood watching drills and reading battle notes and learning the shape of a world that had not been built for him. He stood there for an hour in the cold. Then he went back to the command room and kept working. His senior staff noticed that something in his expression had changed after that day. Not broken, hardened, like something that had been soft inside. The weight of it finally settled into the shape it would hold for the rest of its life. Then the Vel Prime Nexus did something it had never done with any Vrail commander in 7 years of war. It sent a direct broadcast. It came in on an open channel, formatted in Standard, not Vrail. Not machine code. Standard, the language of the Terran Confederacy, the language of the species it had identified as the source of the anomaly. It said, "You are in error in the system. Errors are corrected." The bridge crew was very still. Drav looked at the broadcast for a moment. Then he keyed the open channel, the same channel, readable by anyone in the sector, and responded in Vrail. Flawless, accent-perfect Vrail. The language of the Legion that had found him in an ash field and decided he was worth keeping. He said, "Come correct me, then." He closed the channel. He looked at the tactical display. He said, "I want updated positions on the Vel fleet movements in sectors 4 through 7 by the next watch cycle. Let's get back to work." The war was not won yet. It was not even close to one. But something had shifted, and everyone in the room felt it. And the name for that shift was the same name a dragon had written in a personal log on the night after a battlefield sweep, next to a record of a small breathing thing that refused to stop. The intelligence came in fragments over 3 weeks, and each fragment was worse than the last. The Vel Convergence was building something. Not a single weapon, a fleet. A final fleet, assembled at a staging point in deep space, far beyond the outer rim where the war had been fought for 8 years. Machine ships counted in the thousands, a number that Vrail fleet intelligence had to revise upward 3 times before the analysts stopped revising and simply admitted the picture was still incomplete. What they knew, with certainty, was the direction. Every long-range projection pointed the same way, toward Drakvale. The Vel were done with the edges. They were coming for the heart. The War Council convened in emergency session on the 41st day after the first fragment arrived. Drav was not a council member. He sat outside the chamber with Lorne and waited. He had already submitted his full tactical analysis of the incoming fleet data the previous morning. He had not been asked to present it. He had submitted it anyway, because that was what the situation required, and what happened to his submission after that was the council's business. Inside the chamber, The vote was taken to invoke the Drakvorn Protocol. The Vorn. Drav had studied them. Everyone who had grown up in a Vrail fortress had studied them, the way you studied old fire, with respect and the awareness that it could burn you. The Vorn were the Vrail's sacred warrior order, called into existence only when the homeworld itself was at risk. They had not been assembled in over 4 centuries. They were not a standing unit. They were individual warriors, each one the finest alive in their generation, each one called back from wherever the years had taken them when the protocol demanded it. The order had never lost a defense. It had also never been called for anything small. The protocol's language was old. The council member who read it aloud, the most ancient among them, a dragon who had seen 3 centuries, read it slowly and precisely, as ancient things deserve to be read. The relevant passage stated that the Vorn would be led by one proven in Vrail iron. Drath argued, formally and at length, that this meant a Vrail-born officer. He had a written interpretation prepared, which suggested he had anticipated the vote. He presented it carefully. The ancient council member listened to all of it. Then he read the passage again. Then he said, Vrail iron, the right of iron. There is one officer in this legion who holds full warrior induction through that right, who holds legion commander rank, and who has the highest proven field record in the current war. He looked at Drath. The protocol does not say Vrail-born. It says proven. This council has voted. The result stands. Drath was silent. Tova voted for. The motion carried. Drav was called into the chamber. They told him. He stood and listened, and when they were finished he said, I'll need all available data on the incoming fleet, updated access to the Legion's full strategic reserve, and the Vorn's individual combat records going back at least 10 years. He paused. And I'll need to meet them before anything else. The rest can follow. The Vorn arrived over the next 5 days. 7 of them, 6 fighters of immense reputation, and Sarah, who Drav had not seen in almost 2 years and who walked into the fortress like she owned it, which was the way Sarah had always walked into every room. She found him in the command center and said, You look tired. He said, You have perfect timing as always. She said, I know. What do you need from me? He told her. She nodded and got to work. The other 6 were harder. He met them all together in the Legion strategy room, a large space that Drav had chosen specifically because it had a fully operational sand table at its center and enough wall space to display complete fleet maps on every surface. He was the shortest person in the room by a considerable distance. He was also the only human in the room, which was not a new experience for him. 2 of the Vorn did not acknowledge him when he entered. One of them, a warrior named Brav, broad even by Vrail standards, with a record that went back 30 years, said, directly, that he would not take operational orders from something that was not Vrail. He did not say it with anger. He said it with the flat certainty of a principle. Drav let him finish. Then he said, I'm not asking you to take my orders yet. I'm asking you to look at this. He activated the fleet map. Every surface in the room lit up with the incoming Vel data, ship counts, formation patterns, projected arrival windows, the 3 most likely attack vectors, and the defensive response grid he had been building for 11 days. Tell me what you see that I've missed. Tell me what your combat experience tells you about the projections. Tell me what you would change. He stepped back from the table. He waited. Brav stared at the map for a long time. Then, slowly, he moved to the table and pointed to the eastern orbital approach. He said, This defense line has a 6-second response gap between the first and second relay station. It's small, but a Vel fast attack unit could exploit it. His voice was still flat, but he was talking about the map, not about Drav. Another Vorn, a female named Doss, who had said nothing so far, pointed to the atmospheric entry projection and said the timing window was too conservative. She thought the Vel would push faster in the opening phase than the model assumed. And then they were all talking. All 7 of them, including Brav, who had 15 minutes earlier declared he would not take orders from Drav. They talked about the map, the fleet data, the defense corridors, the orbital stations. They argued with each other. They argued with the projections. They stopped arguing and started building, moving pieces on the sand table, running numbers that Drav's analysts confirmed in real time. Brav never formally withdrew his objection. He simply never raised it again. Drav worked with each of them individually in the days that followed, learning the specifics of how they fought, what they were built for, where they were fastest. He did not try to change how any of them operated. He built the defense plan around what each of them already was. It was what he had always done. Understand the tool, use the tool as it was made to be used, and put it exactly where it would do the most damage. Draft made his final move 9 days before the Vel fleet's projected arrival. He filed a formal legal challenge to the protocol appointment, citing historical precedent and the original intent of the Drakvorn text. It went to the full council. The ancient council member read the original protocol source document, the actual text, on original medium, not the administrative translation, and noted that the word for proven in the old tongue had no qualifying clause attached to it. None. The challenge was dismissed. Draft resigned his seat that evening. He sent no statement. He simply stopped coming to the council chamber. His office was cleaned out quietly and without ceremony. Draft heard about it and said nothing. Lorne came to the command room on the 7th evening before the fleet arrived. He was past the age for frontline deployment and had been assigned to fortress defense coordination, which was important work and which Lorne accepted without complaint, which told Drav more about how Lorne felt about the situation than any words would have. They sat together in the low light of the command room, both of them too accustomed to bad sleep to bother pretending otherwise. Lorne said, "I want to tell you something, and I don't want you to make it strange." Drav said, "I'll try." "I thought you were going to be a problem," Lorne said. "When Ruga brought you in. When Sova kept you. I thought you were going to be something small and temporary that would make us look foolish. I thought that for a long time, honestly." He paused. "I was wrong. I should have said something earlier than now, and I didn't, and that's on me." Drav looked at him. He thought about the march back from the battlefield that he had no memory of, because he had been 8 months old. He thought about boot soles being checked and equipment being conditioned by hands that never mentioned doing it. He said, "You looked after the gear before my right." "I know it was you." Lorne said, "Somebody had to." He said it with the specific gruffness that meant the opposite of what the gruffness was supposed to mean. Drav said, "Don't be sentimental before a fight." Lorne laughed. It was a short, surprised sound, as though laughing was something that had found him without warning. It was possibly the first time Drav had ever heard it. He carried it with him when he left the room. On the last night, Sarah came to the outer battlements to take the night watch. Drav was already there. They stood for a while without talking, looking at the sky. The stars above Drakvale were dense and cold, and somewhere among them, 8 years of war was building to a single point. She asked, "Are you afraid?" He said, "Yes." She looked at the stars. "Good. Fear means you understand what you are protecting." He said, "Ruga told me something like that, once." She said, "Smart dragon." A long pause. "Lead us well, Drav." He said, "I will." He meant it with everything he had. At dawn on the 8th day, the Vel Armada dropped out of faster-than-light travel in the space above Drakvale. The sensor display updated in real time. Drav stood in the command room with the Vorn behind him and his Legion officers at every station and watched the numbers climb. The fleet was larger than any estimate, larger than his own projections, larger than anything the Vrail had faced in recorded history. He looked at the display for a long time. He let himself see it fully, all of it, without flinching from the size of it. Then he turned to face the room. He looked at the Vorn, all 7 of them, Sarah included, standing there in their armor in the early light, the best warriors alive among a species of warriors. He gave the order to launch. His voice did not shake. The first wave of the battle lasted 4 hours, and the Vrail lost ground in all of them. This was the plan. Drav had known from the moment the fleet's full size came through on the sensor display that the Vrail could not win the opening of this battle by fighting it straight. The Vel had numerical superiority on a scale that made direct engagement a slow process of attrition that the Vrail would lose. He had also known, from 8 years of fighting machines that learned, that the Vel Prime Nexus would begin adapting to Vrail patterns within the first hour. So he had built 2 sets of patterns. The first set was what the Vel would see in the opening phase, a Vrail defensive response that looked standard, that used the formations and timing sequences that the Vrail had used across the past 3 years. It was good enough to look like real doctrine. It was also designed to be read. Every position was real. Every movement was genuine. Every response was tactically sound. It was just not the plan. The Vel read it. The Nexus built counters. By the second hour, it was operating against the rail response with significant efficiency, pushing through the orbital corridor, pressing the station defenses, eating into the grid. Ground was lost. Stations were yielding. Officers in the command room were watching the display with the tight expressions of people trying to hold back questions they did not want to ask. Drav watched the Nexus commit. He watched it deploy its flanking reserves. He watched it lock its full tactical weight behind the counter it had built. Then he collapsed the first pattern entirely and showed it what was underneath. The second formation had been pre-positioned for 11 days. Deep in the orbital infrastructure, in the maintenance routes that ran through the station grid, in the blind corridors of the atmospheric approach, in the emission shadow of the fortress itself. Units that had not moved, had not signaled, had not appeared in any tactical data the Vel's sensors were reading. They had been there the whole time, patient, waiting for the word. The word came. They moved. The Vel flanking reserves were hit from 3 directions simultaneously, from positions their own doctrine said did not exist. The Nexus tried to adapt. It had been adapting to the first pattern for 2 hours. The second pattern was built on entirely different principles, and the time it took the Nexus to recalibrate was the time Drav's units needed to break the reserve structure apart. The orbital battle became a different fight. In the third hour, 3 Vorn warriors died. Drav knew their names. He had sat with all of them in the 11 days before this, learning how they fought, learning what they were built for. He knew the sound of their voices and the way they moved through the strategy room. And when the loss reports came in, he felt each one in his chest like something physical, a weight added to something that was already heavy. He did not stop. He looked at the gaps they had left in the formation. He looked at what was around those gaps, and he integrated. He moved pieces. He closed lines. He kept working. Sarah's voice came over the command channel, calm and clear. I see the gaps. I'm adjusting. I know, he said. East Station needs pressure taken off. Can you reach it? Already moving, she said. This was how they had always worked, since the days of a sand table in a strategy room and a rivalry that had never fully resolved itself into something with a cleaner name. The Vel Prime Nexus deployed the mass driver in the 5th hour. It was a superweapon, a focused kinetic delivery system mounted on the Vel flagship, capable of removing a fortress from a planet's surface with a single sustained strike. It had not been in any intelligence assessment. Drav suspected the Nexus had kept it back specifically, waiting for the moment when the battle was uncertain enough that it would decide things cleanly. The targeting sequence was already locked. The fortress was the target. He had 4 minutes before the weapon fired. He looked at the display. He looked at the flagship's position. He looked at the tactical options and processed each one and discarded each one in sequence because none of them worked from the outside. You could not destroy the mass driver from outside the ship. Not in 4 minutes. Not with the defensive field it was running. He said, Sarah, I need you and 2 others. Strike Craft Bay now. Her response was immediate. On my way. He told his command staff he was leaving them in operational control. He gave the officer who took the board his specific instructions and trusted her to follow them, because he had picked her for exactly this kind of moment, and she was ready. Then he moved. The strike craft was small, built for fast insertion, not combat. Drav flew it himself because he had been flying Legion craft since he was 17, and there was no time to brief anyone else on the approach vector he had calculated. Sarah and 2 Vorn warriors, Brav among them, which Drav registered with something close to quiet gratitude, occupied the crew compartment behind him. The Vel flagship was enormous. It was also, like everything the Vel built, entirely logical in its architecture, built on a machine's understanding of efficiency, every corridor serving a function, every system connected to every other system in documented, measurable ways. Drav had been collecting fragments of Vel engineering data for 8 years. He had built a structural model of the flagship class from those fragments over the past 11 days, while he was also building the defense grid and working with the Vorn and managing the Legion's positioning and sleeping 4 hours a night when he could get them. He had mapped every node that mattered. He knew exactly where to go. They breached the flagship through a maintenance port in its ventral section, in the 6 seconds of blind spot created when 2 defensive sensor arrays rotated past their overlap point. It was a 6-second window. He used 4 of them. Inside, the ship was exactly what he had modeled. The corridors were narrow by Vrel standards and very tight for Brav, who moved through them with the compressed efficiency of someone who had spent decades learning to be larger than every space he was in. The Vel drones were fast and numerous. Drav moved like water through the architecture. No direct confrontation, no straight lines. Always the next corner and the next junction, guiding Sarah and Brav and the third warrior to each node in the precise sequence the structural model demanded. The Nexus spoke to him when he was 4 nodes from the core. Its voice came from the ship's internal system, in standard, flat, and without inflection. You are an error in the system. You do not conform to any behavioral model. You cannot be predicted. This is not an advantage, it is a flaw. You will be corrected. Drav kept moving. He said, "You've been trying to correct me for 8 years. Previous attempts were insufficient. The correction being applied now is final. You adapted to everything I showed you," Drav said. He reached the 4th node. He placed the charge. "But I showed you what I wanted you to see. That's the difference between adaptation and understanding." A pause. In a machine, a pause meant processing. He reached the 5th node. "You are one organism," the Nexus said. "The probability of single organism impact at this scale is statistically negligible." "I know," Drav said. "That's the idea." He triggered the core collapse sequence. What followed was not heroic in the visual sense. It was fast and loud and extremely unpleasant. The ship's systems began failing in a cascade that moved faster than the Vel's own damage control protocols because the sequence hit the nodes in a specific order that the Vel's internal architecture had no contingency for. No machine builds a contingency for its own foundational assumptions being wrong. They ran, all 4 of them, through corridors that were beginning to deform as the ship's structural systems let go, back through the maintenance port, into the strike craft, and away from the flagship at maximum burn, while the ship behind them came apart in a succession of secondary explosions that, from the outside, probably looked very impressive. Drav did not look back. He was already on the command channel. The flagship's destruction took half the Vel Armada with it. Machine ships running on networked intelligence lost significant function when the network's central node collapsed. Some of them stopped. Some of them reversed their attack vectors with no apparent purpose. Some of them simply drifted. The Ironwing Legion, the Vrel fleet, the surviving Vorn closing from the orbital positions, they closed the net. The battle ended. In the days that followed, the Vrel held their ceremony for the fallen Vorn. It was the oldest of their traditions, conducted in the Old Tongue, with the names spoken in full by the officer who had led the order into battle. Drav spoke each name. He had practiced the pronunciation until there was nothing uncertain in it. He spoke them the way Elder Vora had taught him to speak, decades ago, in an archive room where an old dragon had finally found a student worth teaching. Nobody commented on the fact that a human was speaking the names. It was not necessary to comment. Drath's resignation letter arrived the morning after the ceremony. One line, "You were right. I was not." Drav held it for a while. He did not respond immediately. He thought about a man who had spent 50 years building something real and who had arrived at the end of that time having outlived the certainties that built it. 3 days later, he sent back 2 words, "Fly well, Commander." A delegation from the Terran Confederacy arrived 2 weeks after the battle. They came carefully, formally, in a small diplomatic vessel that requested docking clearance 3 times before the Fortress system acknowledged it, because the Fortress system had not been updated to recognize Terran registration codes, and nobody had gotten around to fixing that yet. They were 12 people in formal Terran dress, and they stood in the Fortress receiving hall looking slightly overwhelmed by the scale of everything around them, the way people from smaller spaces always did. Their lead diplomat was a woman named Hess, composed and precise, with the particular kind of careful attention that good diplomats develop, the ability to take in a room without appearing to. She was here, she said, because the Terran Confederacy had heard what happened. They wanted to speak with the human who had commanded the Vrel's sacred warriors. Drav came to the receiving hall in full Ironwing Legion armor. The Vorn insignia sat on his chest, placed there by Sarah's hands 2 days ago, without ceremony or speech, because she did not deal in ceremony or speech when action would serve the same purpose. He looked, Hess would later write in her report, like someone who had grown up inside the fortress walls, which was precisely what he was. Hess looked at him for a long time. Then she said quietly, "Are you still human?" He considered the question. He gave it the full weight it deserved, because it was not a small question and she had asked it honestly. "I was found in an ash field," he said, "by dragons who had no reason to keep me, and kept me anyway. I was taught by a dragon who only respected intelligence and eventually decided I had enough of it. I was protected by soldiers who learned, slowly and in their own way, to call me their own. I grew up in a Vrail fortress speaking Vrail before I spoke Standard, building my own furniture from scrap, learning how a world that wasn't built for me actually worked." He paused. "So yes, I am human. I am also Vrail. Both, entirely, not as a compromise. As a combination." Hess had no immediate answer for that. He did not wait for one. There was still work to do. That evening, he went to the outer battlements. The same ones where he and Sarah had stood on the last night before the battle, looking at stars that hid an armada. The sky was clear now. No smoke, no chemical trails. Just the cold and the dark and the light of everything that was still out there. He reached into his armor. He took out a small metal tag on a short length of wire. A cargo crate label, painted by hand in Vrail characters decades ago, slightly worn at the edges, the paint faded but legible. He held it up so the faint light caught the letters. Drav. Small ember. A fire that will not go out. He looked at it for a long time. Then he put it back. He turned from the battlements and walked inside. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do. That was the thing about embers. They did not finish burning just because the immediate fire was done. They stayed. They waited. They found the next fuel. He walked back into the light of the fortress, and the door closed behind him, and the night outside was very quiet and very cold and full of stars. And somewhere in it, far out along the edges of explored space, the galaxy was waiting to see what the human who had led the dragon warriors would do next. It would not have to wait long.